Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us here in this latest Basis Technologies webinar in our ongoing series of webinars on DevOps and test automation for SAP. As you can see on the screen, in today's session we'll be considering this perhaps slightly provocative title of why risk-based testing for SAP might be a bad idea in general, but in particular we're going to look at the crucial area of regression testing as well later on in today's webinar. As always, with these webinars, a little bit of admin first of all. Everybody on the call is on mute today, but if you do have any questions as we go through, we'd encourage you to enter those into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to take a look at some of those at the end of the session. This is a recorded webinar, as always, in the Basis Technologies webinar series. So a link to the recording will be sent to everybody who's registered after today's session, probably within the next day or two. So if you want to get hold of that link after this and you don't see it, do please get in touch with us either via our website, or there's some details at the end of today's presentation. Without further ado, let's move on and introduce, I mean, of course, video is a bit of a giveaway these days, but the people you can see on the screen here, today's presenters. My name's Peter Yavsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies. If you've joined a Basis webinar before, you may well have seen or heard me in my new home office, as so many of us are these days. And I'm very pleased to say that I'm joined from a more conventional office over in Dallas, Texas, by my colleague Jim Duggar, who's going to be our expert testing representative on today's call. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Good morning, Pete.
So Jim has many years of experience in the testing industry, and in particular in the world of SAP testing. So he's going to be talking to us in some more detail about this topic of risk-based testing that I mentioned. So let's take a quick look at a very high-level agenda. We've basically split the session up into three different sections. We're going to take a very quick look at kind of setting the scene and the importance of software testing in today's environment, which I'm sure many of you on the call are going to be familiar with and have opinions around. We're going to talk about this topic of why risk-based testing might actually be a bad idea within SAP, and then we're going to look at an alternative solution for some of that testing landscape in the form of this technology called robotic test automation. Before we begin the details, just a little bit of information about Basis Technologies and who we are, for those of you that aren't so familiar with us as a company. We make software automation that changes the way our customers are able to run their SAP systems, and in particular, we help them to bring concepts like DevOps and continuous delivery to their SAP environments, and also automated testing as well through our DevOps and test automation platform, which is specifically engineered for use in SAP and for the specific technical requirements of SAP. And that's why we're here on this webinar today, talking about the topic of SAP testing. We've been working in the SAP space for many years, as you can see on the screen, founded in 1997. So we've been around nearly 25 years now. A great deal of SAP experience within our team. We're a global organization, offices here in the UK, obviously over in the US as well, and also in Europe and Australia, servicing a global network of SAP users. Some of the logos of our customers you can see on the screen there, and very much all kinds of SAP organizations, from somewhat smaller to very, very large, all of whom are reaping the benefits of automation of one kind or another. So that's a quick intro to us and why we're talking about this topic today. Let's get into today's session and talk about testing in general and some of the bigger narratives that are impacting QA teams and software testing. Jim, I know we're working with organizations all over the world, and lots of SAP teams are under pressure for lots of different reasons, but can you tell us a bit about some of the main factors that you see as influencing the testing sphere in particular, and how that's changed over the time that you've been in the industry?
Oh, sure. And I think there's another important conversation here, which is how these changes have reflected back on SAP itself, as well as the dominant ERP that we see in business today. But there's a few things that I would pick out that are my favorite topics around why we see more change, more need for testing, more demand for what we do. And the first of those is just the simple competitiveness and the change around digital business models. We're in a situation today where the level of competition has never been higher across many, many industries, even in some very traditional industries. And the frequency with which business models change and regulatory demand changes and these kinds of inputs to the need to service capability for the business has accelerated. So those kinds of situations create a need to be able to deliver more change, which in turn creates a situation to need more testing and to ensure that the dependability that we're used to is still in those systems. One of the other ones I've seen that's kind of related to this is M&A activity. And this is just consolidation within given industries. We've seen this broadly in banking, broadly in telecom. And so every time a large company buys a small one, they want to consolidate their SAP systems. And now we have to bring two giant piles of Z code together. And of course, there's a lot of outcome from that in terms of making sure that that's going to be successful and not send us into an outage again. But there's another trend that has finally made it to SAP that I think is equally important. We're going to talk about my background in software development long before I could even spell SAP here in a little bit. But one of the things that I've recognized is that we see these concepts of agile methodology and DevOps automation becoming a thing for SAP, partly because of their proven ability to accelerate development life cycles, but also because the technology now exists to make it practical. And so if we're going to do that, if we're going to have a sprint every 2 weeks, if we're going to be constantly delivering release when ready, these kinds of concepts, CI/CD pipelines and so on in SAP, we need to bring testing with it, right? And we need to make sure that every time we're making a change, we're not busting up the business in the process. And probably all of that is happening with the same number of headcount. And so here again, we need to be able to do more with less or do more with the same. These are all factors that I have seen, even for a full decade now, as common drivers to the testing problem.
And I'm sure I would expect, that these pressures will be familiar to the people who've joined us on the call today. We're having conversations about these kind of things on a daily basis, but of course we're talking about the world of SAP, and we've got this demand for maybe more testing, for maybe more efficient or more effective testing, but SAP is in so many ways a bit of a special world and has its own special characteristics. And we've talked about how much time already you've spent in the SAP testing arena in particular. So can you speak to us about some of the particular challenges around SAP testing?
Yeah, these are going to be very familiar to this audience, right? Anyone that's familiar with SAP understands the consequence of outage. It could have a devastating impact to the business. And traditionally, in a way, it's kind of like the old mainframe. We're very careful about the change that we make in SAP, and we tend to be very thorough about the amount of testing that we do because of its potential for adverse outcome within the organization. Right? But we also have to understand that SAP is completely unique architecturally. I mean, I can't go grab Jenkins and a whole bunch of DevOps tools and expect them to work right out of the box in an SAP environment like I might expect if I were doing C# or Java, right? We have to think about that architecture differently. We also have to think about what SAP is doing is very different than, say, like a web server. SAP is literally running long-running business processes. It's got lots of overlap. It's got lots of in-flights. There's lots of different users. It's a very different animal than your traditional distributed system. And so testing for that, we'll get into these methodologies as well, but testing for that is necessarily different because of that. There's two other factors here that I think are unique to SAP. One of them is scale, just the sheer volume of the testing that's required. I dare any customer to do a true inventory of how many unique ways they have to run a business process in their organization that's supported by their SAP system. If OTC is involved, we're already into the tens of thousands just because of VA01, right? And at the same time, we've got to make sure in industries that are FDA validated or that are ISO 9001 or other compliance or other regulatory inputs, that every change we make still runs within the framework that's specified by law or specified by the regulations that our organizations face. So these are all unique. These are well outside the scope of what we might see in a traditional C# or Java environment, and they add additional challenge to SAP.
Okay, thanks. So let's just pick up on that point you made with enterprise-wide impact and the corresponding value of investment in testing SAP software, because I know sometimes, this can be a challenging conversation in some organizations when really the ideal outcome of any of this investment of time and money and effort in testing can actually be nothing to see here. Nothing breaks, ideally no defects. Of course, we can dream. We've got a couple of example numbers on the screen here from out in the market. I'm sure our audience have their own experiences, but how have the companies that you worked with typically seen justify this investment around testing and the value of testing?
That's a really good question. And one of the reasons why, I mean, if we were going to do a volume stream mapping of the software development and release process, when we got to testing, it would fall into a category called non-value add activity, things that we have to do to be successful, but that don't bring specific measurable value to the organization. After all, the best thing that can happen during a test cycle is we found no defects, and therefore we've wasted our time. Now, I think that's not a very fair description of the value that testing really brings, because most of us have insurance on any number of things that we care about, right? What we're really thinking about with testing is how do we prevent one of these outages that IDC measures at $1 million an hour? And even for smaller organizations, say in the couple of billions of dollars of turnover a year, we can easily get to $100,000 an hour if there's an invoicing outage or an inventory loss or other things that are adverse that could come from losing our ERP system, right? And never mind the fact that when we have one of these go completely wrong, we have to go back to the organization and redo all of that work, which is inherently itself a non-value add activity. After all, we're just doing rework. This is a really, really big part of the story. So this idea of risk reduction, this is why we do testing, right? I don't think anyone's surprised on this call to find out you have to test something to make sure you're not going to take down the organization when you push the change. No big surprise. So that's how to think about this, in my opinion, is it's really about making sure we don't create a costly situation, not so much as we maybe save money by not testing or something like that.
And again, I guess we might say, given the criticality and impact of SAP, potential impact of problems, that any investment you make is going to have that much more value because of the scope of the scenario you're dealing with. So, that's, if you like, the why. But of course, the other point that's always worth mentioning when we talk about testing is that it's also about when you do the testing that can be important and make a real difference. And this is a chart that it's been around for a while, actually, now originally from some IBM research a couple of years ago. But talk us through the implications of what we see on the screen here.
Well, I know the credit is to IBM in 2010 here, but I'm going to say this was known in the 1960s. There's a great series of articles out there called The Mythical Mammoth that was about the original OS 360 implementation on IBM mainframes. I mean, it's been around a minute, even for guys like you and me, right? So what they discovered, though, was that at each point in the waterfall, you had about a factor of 10 involved in the cost of a remediation. So, and this won't surprise anybody either, right? If I'm an ABAPer and I'm sitting there on my workbench and I detect a defect and I fix it right there, that's going to be a substantially lower cost to the organization than if it made it all the way into production and I started shipping goods for the wrong price or doing what other incorrect outcome that came from that. This is not a surprise. Now, what's been really challenging in business systems like SAP is achieving this shift left, as it's called in the industry. And it has to do for a lot of technical reasons. Typically, we can't do any testing in SAP until we have the entire assembly in place, fully integrated in a robust QA environment. And so we're waiting very, very late in the software development process to even begin doing defect remediation and identification. But the takeaway here is every time you could move the detection of a defect sooner in the life cycle of a project, it's going to cost you less, and it's going to have less impact on the overall outcomes that you're trying to achieve.
So in an ideal world, we're going to be testing a lot of our system, maybe all of our system. We want to do it as early as possible, but obviously, there's a big generic challenge here, which is always capacity, right? And it's the same in testing as many other fields. I'm sure your development team might say the same. But what's holding testing teams back in particular from being able to achieve as much as they might like, given these pressures we talked about?
Well, I think we need to look at the demand put on the team, and then we'll back into, what they have to give up given those demands, right? But if the expectation is the testing team tests every single variation of business process that the company might depend on, that is an absolutely astronomical amount of work for any team to achieve, no matter what methodology they work. And the basic trade-off that you have is you can either take more calendar time, thus delaying the release, or you can do less testing or add more people, either dramatically raising the cost or dramatically raising the risk. These are kind of the TCQ trade-offs that you get with traditional testing. If we look at the methodologies themselves, manual testing is a simple O for N exchange, right? It's basically how many people do I have doing it is how much testing I'm going to get done in a given period of time. And if I want more testing in the same amount of time, I add people, or if I want more testing, I add time. That these are kind of the two variables, the two sticks that you control in that whole exercise. But there's another, I think, negative to manual testing as a methodology, in that you've got a whole group of people that fully understand how to actually do business and use the system to achieve a positive outcome, and they're spending time not doing work that's productive for the organization, right? I mean, these are people that could actually run the business process, but they're actually having to do it in a QA system. And we know from our own customers, they're even pulling in their SMEs and such from the business side to do this kind of testing to make sure that the system is ready to go. So a lot of negative consequences there. If we look at automation as it exists today, it actually does deliver a benefit. The basic claim of automation is that it's going to take less time to do the same amount of testing. And they're right to the extent that using compute to run the test is faster than using a human. If for no other reason, there's no wait time between mouse clicks, right? But the dirty little secret of these kinds of automation tools is it takes an engineer grade person to write and maintain all the software scripts that are necessary to interact with the user interfaces and drive these tests. And so what you find is that you have a buildup, and you do actually achieve, for the same amount of labor, more testing than you would with manual testing. But at some point you achieve a threshold, and that threshold means that the number of scripts that break, the amount of maintenance that's required to the test harness and the test library and these kinds of things end up consuming all of your resources for creating new tests. So that sets your upward bound. And if you don't continue to invest at that very same level, it actually tails off on the end as more of those scripts break and they're no longer functional. And unfortunately, that upper bound, I mean, I've seen customers get to 50%, but it's way more common that they'll have 20 or 30% coverage and consider themselves very successful with automated testing, because that's, unless you throw a ton of people at it, and a ton of smart people in the case of automation, you're just not going to get more work done than that. That's just the limitations of what it takes to keep those things running.
So that brings us quite naturally then to this idea of risk-based testing. So before we dig into the details, can you just give us a summary of what you mean by risk-based testing as an approach?
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, right? We know there's more testing than we can get done. We're not willing to either pay the cost or the timeline of doing it thoroughly, especially for regression testing, where in theory nothing's been broken, but we got to go make sure anyway, right? So this idea came forth that said, what if we could only test the things that have changed? We would be able to reduce the scope of what we need to test, and therefore go a little deeper instead of just wider every time we do a test cycle. And in theory, we'd have more risk reduction. After all, we're testing in the area where we've made changes and that are more prone to an adverse outcome anyway. And because we're advocating for not doing a lot of the other kind of testing, we're going to be able to go deeper into that particular topic area and do a richer, better job in that space. That's the theory of risk-based testing. Let's focus on what's most important given the nature of the change, and hopefully achieve a better outcome with a parallel or less amount of effort, right?
Okay, so let's. I'm going to pick you up on that word theory there, because I know this is a subject close to your heart. That's why you're here on the webinar with us today. And it may be that in some cases that theory is the best one we've got to go with, and risk-based testing is the least bad way to go. But there is downside there, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next section. So take us through these next couple of slides and talk us through the let's say more negative aspects and downside of this idea of risk-based testing, albeit it comes from its heart in the right place.
It does come with its heart in the right place. And if we were talking about very technical and traditional software development, I might even agree. And we're going to get into some of those points as well. But this is a business system we're talking about. This is SAP we're talking about. And the context is very different in that particular situation. The pinnacle of the problem is that it is very, very difficult to correlate technical change to business process. And although it can be done in a general sense in some ways, and we're going to talk about how risk-based tools do it, as a general rule, it is very hard to make a high degree of correlation between these two. And so consequently, what I'm left with when I do a risk-based analysis in a business system is I'm left with an exposure. I either am not testing some things that are actually subject to risk from change, and that's how I achieve my shortened test cycle. Or the risk analysis is so generally broad, it's told me to test everything anyway. And so I haven't really achieved anything in terms of the analysis that I was trying to do, right? So this is the fundamental problem. And when we double click on this problem, we can start to break down and understand why this idea doesn't work so well.
Okay, so let's dig into that idea of scope a little bit more then.
Yep. So these are just three of any number of reasons why risk-based testing is not such a great methodology for a business system. But I want to give you a little bit of background in my own software development practice and history to explain some of the concepts where it falls down. So I look back at me as a software developer, and I was doing C++ on OS2, kind of date myself there a little bit. But one of the things that I had to do when I checked in a piece of code, I had to be able to also check in all of the unit tests that were associated with that particular function module, that particular object, those particular methods, whatever it was that I was changing, right? And with that, I had to do something called a boundary analysis. I had to be able to prove that every logical branch and flow possible in a given method was actually covered by the set of unit tests that I provide. This guaranteed that at least the constants were always tested and always validated anytime a change was made in a particular method, class, object, whatever it was we were editing, and that we had a very high degree of reliability in terms of the basics of our code. Now, when we think about testing a business system, we are nowhere near the method level. We're probably at the transaction level. Let's think about a transaction like VA01. It's not only got a dozen fields per screen, it's got 40 screens plus that. I mean, what is the amount of flows possible through just that one transaction? And are we even getting close to actually testing that kind of variability with our test library? I'm going to argue not a chance in the world. And that's the second concept. It's called cyclomatic complexity. Every time I checked in a piece of code, I also had to be able to prove that I had all of those different variables covered. And if it was more than just a handful of different logical paths, my manager would compel me to refactor that code, turn it into multiple methods that were much more simple and much easier to logically guarantee that we had full coverage for. Again, in a business system, this is extremely difficult to do. So if you're going to set this idea that, oh, well, I've got a test for VA01, therefore VA01 works, oh, have I got some news for you, because it is never the happy path that brings down production. That is a fact that I have learned in my experience for sure. So this is one of the really big drawbacks of trying to base everything on this risk-based testing that's really going to provide you true coverage. But the last part of this is, how do they even make this assessment in the first place? And for the most part, what risk-based testing tools do is they will look at the objects in a transport. And from those objects, they'll try to bubble up to what programs, what T codes, et cetera, in the SAP system are impacted as a result of those objects being touched. Well, even that has risk with it. And there's several technical reasons why that doesn't work so well either.
Well, that's, I mean, clearly there was there's a strong technical bent to the stuff you've mentioned there, but let's click into that a little more on the next slide in some of the specific technical challenges.
Yeah, so let's just assume we're going to use object dependency, right? This is the popular methodology for this. So my tool has scanned my transports that are being proposed as deliverable to production. And then it scanned my test harness and library and said, you should run these tests as a result of this kind of change that you're making and these objects that you're touching and so on. Well, there's a variety of places that falls down completely. Indirect dependencies are a classic example. So my favorite example of this would be master data in SAP, okay? Unless the objects that are touched have a direct inquiry into that master data, a direct object reference, the risk-based system will never realize that a change in a tax table or a change in master data may well make a significant change in the way the logic performs in that changed object. There's no direct correlation. It can't make the connection. And that can happen when we've got an intermediary object or there's a million reasons why this can happen. But this is one of my favorite examples where, we're actually exposing risk. We've actually made real change to the code. It just doesn't show up in the object analysis. But another example of this would be non-transportable change. So exactly what should you test when you make a system's parameters change, or you update the kernel, or you apply a security patch? What would you scan for? There's nothing transportable in those kinds of changes, right? So you have absolutely no idea what's at risk or what's exposed in those places. And again, it doesn't work. So a more technical one, but one that I love, is polymorphism. Polymorphism has become very popular among ABAP programmers because, like other object-oriented languages, it allows us to put a diverse set of different types of objects in a single container and act on them in a consistent way, but still get the unique behavior that's required for each of the different objects, right? And the thing about polymorphic behavior is it's almost always determined at runtime. So tell me with your static analysis exactly how you're going to determine what objects actually have been changed, because you're not going to know until they're in the container and the method call goes through. And it's the same thing with integration. With an integration, I've got a loosely coupled system. It's probably on web services or an RFC boundary outside my system. There's absolutely no way to tell how your change might impact that relationship or that contract, right? It's completely undetectable because you've got that loose barrier there. So I don't know, I could probably go on for a while. I'm not a fan, obviously. And I just think you've got to be honest with risk. Yeah.
I think at this point our audience will be getting a sense of why you feel there's some valid reasons that, as I say, maybe in the best case, risk-based testing is the least bad of our options today. But I think this, we want to also highlight this fact that we've already mentioned at the start of the webinar, that we're not just talking about new functionality here. You've mentioned regression testing a couple of times. This iceberg slide is one that we like to use to make that point. And just again, just recap for what's the real particular challenge with that below the waterline aspect here when we're considering an SAP estate.
So, let me describe the analogy a little bit. We use this iceberg slide to say the stuff above the waterline is the new features, the new change that you're bringing forward. And the stuff below the waterline is all of the existing functionality that already exists in your business system that your business depends on and uses every day, right? The thing about testing above the waterline is, one, manual testing turns out to be really darn effective. A couple of reasons. It's on top of everybody's mind at the moment. After all, the developer has just written the code. The test engineer has just seen the requirements and responded to them and made sure the functionality works. We as an industry tend to be really, really good at testing new change. And don't forget, there's also usually not that much of it, right? It's only a sprint's worth or a project's worth that's being deployed anyway. But if I look at regression testing, this is the entire functionality of my entire SAP estate that might be affected by these changes, but it's a massive amount of functionality. And this is the part of the testing that's not getting done. I can talk to you about dozens of customers that they do what we call going naked. They go naked on the regression testing because it's just such an insurmountable problem. And yet that's probably where your outage is going to come from. It's going to be an unexpected, inadvertent change that you couldn't have planned for because the scope was too large.
Well, let's map that topic then of risk-based testing to our iceberg. Where does this approach of risk-based testing leave us, considering the overall system landscape?
Yeah, so what risk-based testing is most of the time going to get pretty right is the new changes. After all, we've got dozens of objects going in, transports, all these kinds of things that are making proactive change, and they're going to do a relatively good job of identifying that those tests need to be done. What they're going to advocate that you skip testing is everything more or less below the waterline. And for all those technical reasons and more that we've just been talking about, why it misses that analysis, you may have significant chunks of that iceberg below the water that are subject to change and are subject to risk, but risk-based testing will miss it. But what I think is amusing about risk-based testing is that in the center, it's either completely missing tests that need to be run because your test harness doesn't have those in it and it can't make the correlation, or it's identifying so much change you wouldn't have enough time to get all the work done anyway. And so, as much as I would love risk-based testing to work, it has a tendency to either output results that are wrong and incomplete, or so comprehensive you're back at square one anyway.
Okay, well, we're going to dig into that topic of regression testing in just a second, but just to emphasize as well, to finish off this section, the point we made earlier about pressure on test teams, and one of the bullets we had on that slide was this pace of technological change. This challenge isn't going to get any easier with S4HANA. You talked about kernel patches, upgrades in general are a real testing challenge. What does the maintenance and support outlook for S4 mean for test teams as more organizations move to the new platform?
Well, the biggest change has come from SAP itself, right? As of S4HANA, what we're seeing is SAP be more regular about releases and more aggressive about sunsets. And so to stay in maintenance, we don't have a lot of choice as SAP users. We are going to have to more regularly upgrade. We already know what the tempo is. It's been well published. It's quite a bit faster than it's been with ECC, and we're going to face this problem. That means maybe every year or maybe every year or two, you're looking at wholesale regression and forced upgrades from your vendor. We don't have much choice. We're going to face this problem.
Okay, so let's move to this final part of our webinar, and let's focus more on a positive, let's say, story, and look at more of a solution. We're going to look at this new approach that helps you surmount those traditional testing challenges, particularly in the area of regression testing. So, Jim, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through the next few slides to talk to our audience about Testimony, the product from Basis Technologies, and the robotic test automation technology that underlies it.
Absolutely. So, if I think back when I was a regular testing practitioner, I think back to my goal. What I wanted was a test solution that would let me run everything and let me run it every single time there was a change. Give me as comprehensive a test functionality as possible. Now, one of the things that we knew was because of automation's constraints on resources and test scripts breaking and these kinds of things, that there was that upward bound, and we were still going to face challenges in terms of being able to produce a truly robust test harness that could actually then let us run everything every single time. Not to mention the limitation of desktop-oriented test engines, which required one desktop for each concurrent user. So sometimes the test libraries themselves might take many, many days or even weeks to run unless we had tons of virtualized resources. So when I came to Basis and learned about robotic testing and the approach that the team here was taking, I got very excited because it solves the two halves of the testing problem that I've never seen solved in any other way except here. That first half is what should be tested and how should it be tested. And having a solution that can automatically author the entire testing harness for you is a massive time savings. We're going to get into that in just a second. But imagine not having to do any documentation, not having to do scripting, not having that upfront work that's traditionally associated with test automation. And then the second part, of course, is being able to execute that test set. And lots of tools can execute them rather well, but if you couple that with the ability to create and maintain the test library automatically, you eliminate one of the big barriers to success with automation. So the combination of these two did something that had not been previously solved for in SAP testing automation, and that was provide truly robust, high levels of coverage, especially for regression testing, because it solved for that problem of the investment that was required from the consumer in order to be able to get there. This did the work for you through automation. So if we take a look at what the timelines look like, this is where the big changes start to reveal themselves in terms of your experience with the testing solution. And again, back when I was practicing, I would show up at a customer and say, "Hi, I'm Jim. I'm really happy to be here. What are your business processes?" And we would spend weeks, maybe months, documenting all the business processes, drawing lines between sticky notes on the whiteboard, these kinds of things, just so we understood what all the flows were and what was really important to the business in order to be able to test it accurately and correctly. And of course, we'd come up with more work than we could possibly accomplish, so we'd scope that down. But ultimately, we would build a test harness and a solution over a period of time that allowed the customer to do its first automated test. The basic bargain with testimony is that it eliminates all that upfront work. So not only can the test itself be produced in much less time, but you're going to be ready for testing in much less time, and you're not going to have the maintenance cycle that's associated with traditional automation. And that just takes calendar time out of the process, right? So we're going to get you there a little faster, quite a bit faster actually, and we're going to be able to allow you to repeat that cycle at a much higher tempo, which of course solves for the problem that we face as test professionals with being able to have enough resource and enough capacity to be able to handle the demands that are being placed on us today versus what we saw maybe 10 years ago. So this is the basic bargain of testing. Now, this is a very large claim, and I want to talk through how a test vendor could possibly say, you're not going to have to do any scripting, and we're going to solve these problems for you because this is very unique. So the premise of how testimony works is we have developed an instrumentation capability for ABAP. For those of you that have done software development outside of ABAP, maybe C# or Java, you've probably heard of something called bytecode instrumentation. Basically, it's a way within the VM itself to be able to understand every method call, every object invocation, the actual things that happen at a compute level within that system. Well, we've built that same thing for ABAP. And the way that we use that technology is we will deploy this into a customer's production environment and go record the real production environment being used. So we get to see every dialog login, every dialog transaction, every RFC call, every BAPI, every batch job. And if it happens in an SAP system, we have the ability to be able to record it and see it and understand what the real production user got in terms of an outcome from the SAP system at that moment. So what we do is we take a system copy at the same time that we start that recording. And this allows us to create what I've labeled here, that disposable SAP production copy. What it really is it's an isolated copy of a production environment. But what's unique about it is all the things that we've recorded haven't happened yet. So with that environment, we transport in any change that we want to test, or if you're doing things like a kernel patch or a non-transportable change, you go ahead and apply those to that test environment in a normal fashion. And then what testimony will do is literally set the clock back on that system, fool it into thinking it really is in a production environment, even though it's isolated and it's by itself. And it will rerun that entire day, few hours, whatever we recorded, rerun everything that we saw in that production environment against that test system. So for regression testing, this is a really elegant way to solve this problem because we haven't had to write any scripting. We don't even have to know what our business processes are. Right? The system's done that for us. But the beauty of it is, if we've got a bunch of, I'm going to call them rogue, but brilliant rogue users that have figured out better ways to do things in the system than we had documented, in our blueprints, guess what? We're testing those too. So all of the ways that the system is actually utilized in production are getting truly tested in a regression fashion and ensuring that they're going to behave after change the same way that they behaved during production. And this is the basic approach of testimony to solve this problem. So let's take a look at some coverage, This is probably my favorite part of the outcomes from testimony. Because testimony is literally recording real production usage, the amount of coverage that we get tends to be substantially higher than traditional methodologies. And it's simply because we're throwing the brute force of robotics at this problem, and we've got more ability to do more work by using compute to do the script authoring and that kind of work than using traditional human labor. The other thing that happens is these recordings tend to last a little while. So most of my customers only refresh from production, say quarterly, or maybe even biannually or annually. And as it turns out, that's about all you need to do with the testimony as well. So imagine that we record in January here, where you see the real high bar coverage, and then reuse that same test in February and March. Yeah, you're going to lose a little bit of coverage, but you're only going to lose coverage of the new features that have been adopted by your end users. You can actually reuse that test over and over and over for a quarter or maybe even more. And this allows us to run the tests much more frequently than ever before. It allows us to run the tests much sooner in the software development lifecycle. Oftentimes, I work with customers on using transports of copies out of dev. So we haven't even released the transports to QA yet, and we're already doing that first round of remediation with one of these recordings and playback systems. It's just a completely different way to think about testing a business system like SAP than's been available in industry before.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Well, let's take a quick look then at the respective differences, particularly as regards regression testing that we've talked about today.
Yeah, I mean, this is not going to surprise anyone on this call. We've been doing these kinds of things for a long time, right? Manual testing is a high effort product. You get exactly out of it what you put into it, right? And although it's good, it's very high quality, it's also extremely high effort. The idea with risk-based regression testing is that you're going to reduce the amount of testing that you do. It advocates for reducing test scope, right? So we're going to do less testing. And the theory is that it's going to also reduce your risks because you're testing the things that have changed. But in practice, I think the perception of risk reduction is much higher than reality because, after all, it's advocating for you to not test some things that actually have changed. And we've talked about some of the technical reasons that lead into that problem. So the nice thing about the robotic test automation idea is that you put less effort into it simply because we're using robotics to do all the work. But it's doing the real whole work of running everything and running it every time. So the amount of risk reduction that you get and the amount of testing advantage that you get is simply a function of the fact of using robotics to do this massive amount of testing as opposed to depending on more manual technologies. And that's its advantage, plain and simple.
Great. So just before we finish up, then just wrap up those benefits of robotic test automation for us again.
Sure. So, this is time-honored TCQ, right? The idea of increasing the quality by testing more frequently and having the ability and capacity to do that means that we're reducing the risk, the odds of an outage that happen to us as an organization when something reaches production that's not working correctly. And by shortening the testing cycle and the time it takes to actually perform all that testing, not only are we able to reduce that risk, but we're able to do it more frequently and we're able to do it in less time. And so we're able to decrease the time it takes for us to get stuff out of queue and into pre-prod and production. And then finally, simply because we aren't having people doing all this work manually, we're able to allow those SMEs and other individuals that may have been participating in script authoring or business process discovery or these kinds of activities to go back and do their day jobs, which is also very helpful for the organization. So every once in a while, the TCQ triangle isn't a trade-off. Sometimes innovation comes forward and everything gets better, and this is one of those times.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jim. So let's just wrap up a quick summary of today's session, then we've seen that there's a lot of factors driving the push for more comprehensive testing, maybe better testing, more pressure on software teams, and part of that is because the cost of poor quality, especially in systems like SAP, can be so high. And risk-based testing does help us with some of that testing capacity challenge, but it's an approach that has flaws, some of which Jim talked about today. And regression testing in particular really highlights the limitations of risk-based testing as an approach because of the scope that we're talking about in particular there in SAP. So robotic test automation provides a more effective alternative way for you to address that really important topic of regression testing with less effort and ultimately less business risk then as you're making changes to your SAP systems. So that's the end of today's session, and we'll take a quick look at some Q&A in a moment. But just before we do, it just remains for me to thank Jim for taking us through that content today, and to thank all of you for joining us here. If you'd like to learn more or discuss offline any more details around what testimony and robotic test automation can do please feel free to get in touch with us. You can see the web address on the screen there, and also Jim's email if you'd like to reach out to him directly to talk about anything we've covered today. And of course, we would encourage you to keep an eye on the Basis Technologies website for future webinars in our ongoing series. As I mentioned, this is a recorded session today, and we will be sending the link out to everyone who registered. So if you want to get that, and for any reason you don't see it, do please feel free to get in touch. So just, we're nearly up to time anyway, but just we have had a couple of questions that come in, so we'll just take a quick look at those. First one, Jim, I'll paraphrase as always, but how does testimony solve for test data? That wasn't something you covered in the presentation, but obviously that's a significant concern.
Yeah, so test data is another dirty secret of automation. And as a little side homework project for the attendees, I dare you to go price test data management solutions versus testing solutions. You're going to be into a little bit of a surprise for which one is actually the more complicated problem to solve. So testimony solves for the test data problem completely, and it does it with that system copy. And this is a unique advantage of SAP's architecture, that we're able to bring over a system with all of its state and all of its data intact. And that allows us to reuse that data in place to re-execute the exact same transactions that the end users did. So the test that we create, the recording that we create, and that system image walk hand in hand. They do have a dependency on each other, but because of that dependency, we completely eliminate the test data problem. And so it's not something you have to concern yourself with. Okay,
great, thank you. Got another one here. I think this one comes up quite likely. What if we have a periodic business, for example, times when certain activities don't happen? So I guess with regard to the recording and testimony.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very, very good question, very astute observation. It is true that you may need multiple recordings, and that is certainly something the product is capable of doing. So if you have a highly periodic business, say for example, you do all of your inventory or all of your invoicing or something in a certain period of the month, and all of your order processing and those kinds of things happen in a different period of month, the best way to solve that is two different recordings. One of the things that we're going to help you with, though, we actually have a workflow analysis capability built into testimony. So we're going to do an analysis of your production workflows, and we're automatically going to know when the best times to record are, or if there's multiple times in order to get really good coverage. We'll be able to compare your utilization of your production system to any recording we make, and we will have a down to the percentage point analysis of exactly how well covered it is in the test library. So this is something that's solved for in the product as well.
Okay, thanks. Just want to say I can see the note here from Annette. Annette, if you're still with us, I'm not quite sure what your question there was about product risk analysis. So if you'd like to discuss that with us, separately, as I say, you can get in touch with Jim there using the details on the screen. Just want to note that I could see your note there. We do have another question here. how does testimony provide feedback on the analysis done in the test environment? So I guess maybe, Jim, relating to the point you just made there.
Yeah, the best way to see the answer to this question is to take a product demo. But what happens when we do a playback is our agent, in addition to executing the business process or the programmatic interface against SAP, is also recording every step along the way. So we have something that we call the defect browser that allows you to pop up, see what was observed in production, what was observed at test playback time. It highlights the differences. It takes screenshots. It shows you the error messages that pops up. You can even see the data payloads that happened in both different sequences and the screen responses and field responses. So yeah, this is something that what it basically does is it turns the post-test execution into something that an SME can peruse, identify what is or isn't an error, assign them. We have some ALM-like features built into the product, and we can go from there. But that's how we solve that, is we literally give you the ability to do a diff between production and test playback.
Okay, great. Well, that's I think that's all we've got in the Q&A. And as I said, we're very nearly up to the end of the session. So I think we'll draw a line there and say once again, thank you to everyone for joining us. And Jim, thanks for your time. And we hope to see all of you again on a future Basis Technologies webinar.